Welcome back. We're up to part 6 of our look into the Simplified Yang 88 Taijiquan long form. We've now progressed into, I would say, the meat of the form. The first 5 moves, all the way up into single whip, I think constitutes its own little miniature section. And then we did play peepaw and white crane spreads wings last time. So now we're into brush knee. Brush knee you will see repeated a lot in this form. It is repeated probably the most after grass sparrow's tail and single whip, if I had to number it, which I haven't off the top of my head. Brush knee is a fairly simple move, all things considered. Like most of the other forms in Taiji, most of the other moves in our form, everything is moving. All of our limbs are moving, all of our feet are moving. We're also turning as we're with our movement to generate the movement. So it is kind of complex in that fashion, but when you break it down, it seems like it should be relatively simple, and the truth is it is relatively simple. But there's still a lot going on, and internally, especially a lot going on. So that's what we're going to take a look at. So following our customary format, we will start off out on the floor, go over a few, or really just one main point to focus on with the stepping, and look at the overall frame of the move, and then return back here against the wall for a more critical analysis. Now to begin, we turn our hips to the left, left hand lifts, right hand drops, turn, come across, and begin to settle into our hip even more as we lift the right arm and pick up the left foot. Now we extend the left foot and then shift, left arm drops, right arm lifts and turn across before both of our palms settle into place. This will finish in what we call a bow stance, which should look familiar to you as we've done bow stance already in the first couple moves of the form. One of the key points to this that we'll touch on in just a few minutes is going to be stepping forward. So far, we've only really had one step forward in the form, and that was the opening move, the commencement, when we finish lifting and dropping our arms and then step forward. This is the exact same sort of stepping, except now our hands are doing something different. So we want to make sure that we remember how to step, even though our arms are doing a slightly different motion. When we're stepping, we want to make sure that we're settling into our back hip, and after we've settled enough into our back hip, we're pulling, contracting up into our core to pull this foot up. And then as we step, that expands outward, and now make sure this is planted, then shift and turn without over shifting. Key pointer to stepping in, especially Yang Tai Chi, but this applies to, again, pretty much every style of Tai Chi I've ever studied. When we get to this posture here, we should be able to see, not that we should be looking down, but we should be able to see our toes past our knee. If we've shifted here and I look down and I can't see my toes, look at the angle my knee is making. Look at the angle the shin is making with reference to the toes and the foot. That's too far forward. We don't want to be too far forward. We want to be forward enough. We don't want to be too far back. We want to be forward enough, but we don't want to be too far forward. All right, we'll start off with the external components here. Our hands are going up and down, and our feet are, well, our front foot is coming in just a little bit because we take, if there was any weight on it, which given that it was an empty stance that we're starting off in, there shouldn't have been, but we pick our foot up and then extend it forward and then shift our weight into that foot. And along the way, there are a couple of turns through the hips, as one would expect out of our usual Taiji move. Remember, when we're dealing with bow stances, we want to think that we're stepping on train tracks. Left foot goes on the left track, right foot goes on the right track. And we also want to make sure that with our bow stance, our front foot, the toes are pointed straight forward, and our back foot, the toes are angled no greater than like 65 or 70 degrees with relation to the front foot being 0. In other words, we don't want to be stepping such that our feet make an L shape. where they're 90 degrees. The toes are 90 degrees from each other. And the reason for this is because when you've done that and stepped into that position, that actually tenses up the hips. It doesn't render them completely immobile unless you already have some pre-existing, rather serious hip condition. But for most people without such a problem, it won't render them immobile, but it will start to lock them up, and that's not what we want. We want to be able to turn our hips to the degree they're able to in such a position as much as we can. Because that turning of the hips, turning through the hips, is one of the chief ways in which we generate power as well as maintain our stability in times when we are challenged and when force isn't going the way we expect it to. We want to be able to relax the hips, rotate through them, relax the legs, push through those, and if your feet are at 90-degree angles, no can do. The hips don't let that happen. For the sake of this move, we're going to consider the body in terms of positions upwards or downwards, but we'll go with upwards. When we're using our hands, we want to think of where along this plane are our hands, which plane are they going to be settling on, which planes are they moving through. So we can think of our waist. Below our waist is our groin. If we just drop our hand and move it across, it'll be at approximately that level. We can also think of chest, lower chest, and shoulders. That's coming across just in front of here or coming across just in front of here. Face and head, in other words, above the shoulders or above the head. For Taiji, it does happen. We do sometimes put our hands all the way above the head, as you'll see when we get to things like Golden Rooster. And we also will drop them down below the waist for several moves, like you could argue that needle to sea bottom is kind of like this, or you see this happen a bit more in Chen style than in Yang, but it does still happen in the Yang. Most of our hands are going to be operating somewhere between the waist level and the head level, head and face level, so that it should go above the shoulders, generally speaking, depending on the move, right? When we do single whip, that comes pretty much to face level and then settles at shoulder level. In this case, we are coming above shoulder level with our back hand, and then as we come across and finish, it finishes pretty much in front of the shoulder, so at the shoulder level. When considering brush knee, we should also, or it might help to start with considering what brush knee is not, because this is a move that is very easy to think you know what you're looking at and think you're replicating what you're looking at, only to find that you're actually loading your body, especially your shoulders, all wrong, and you're doing the wrong thing, which is going to affect future development of your Taiji practice. So when we do the move, you'll notice that it looks like it's a push, or perhaps if you're martially inclined, some kind of palm strike where you're hitting with the palm or pushing with the palm. And while you're not wrong in that, we want to make sure that we're not doing something where we're coming through and then pushing from like this position out like we're doing a push-up, because we're not doing that. That's not the motion of the move. When you watch the full move performed, once we get into this posture where my hand's out here, the elbow's lifting the arm, lifting the hand, but then it's just lifting the hand and then we're rotating around. This is a nice big round open shape before it settles into place at the end. There's very little push, like a push-up action going on. We don't do that very much. In fact, in Taiji, we do it almost none at all, except for like maybe the very end you might suggest that, but we'll get to that part in just a second. I want to emphasize that this is, like all the other moves we're doing so far in the form, a very big, very expansive posture. Remember what I said about the idea of ward off and rollback being in every move in the form? Well, when we are getting into this posture and now we're opening up here, we want to think nice, big, expressive. Even though this is dropping, yielding perhaps, or pressing. It might be pushing outward, not pressing. It might be pushing outward, this might be lifting up. This could be yielding from this direction or applying pressure, as we see in the form, in this direction. But that only works because we're nice and big. If we're too small like this, and then we fold the elbow over and we push out, if you're, if you've mastered the move, you can get that to work without too much difficulty. But if you don't know what you're doing yet, if you're still a beginner, don't do it that way. If you're a beginner, do it as big as you possibly can, so long as you're maintaining your posture and maintaining all of your other Taiji martial principles. You're not lifting. You don't want to be lifting the shoulder in order to do it. You don't want to be stooping the neck. You don't want to be doing anything like that. It has to be core and axis, nice and straight up and down, arms full, but not bending, breaking posture here. Just all the way up, nice and big and full, and then turn, rotate, and push or brush the knee. In case you haven't noticed, the brush knee is the lower hand, which is very intriguing actually to consider, because I mentioned in a different piece, Yang style tends to heavily favor the notion of opposite correlation between hand and foot. So in brush knee is a perfect example of such a thing. As with brush knee, we have here our left foot is forward, but our right hand is forward. So opposite correlation, which one's forward, as opposed to same side, left and left, or right and right. In this case, left and right for that motion generating forward pressure. But the move is called brush knee because the same hand, the left hand, is the one that is brushing our front knee as the right hand is pushing forward. Now remember all the way back when we looked at press in the second half of Grasp Sparrow's Tail. We were talking about this sort of relationship between fullness of foot and emptiness of hand, and how these will switch as you do certain things, as you shift your body weight from one to the other. Going back to press, we can remember that the foot that is full correlates to the hand that is sort of static, things that you're moving things around, and the foot that is empty correlates to the hand that will be active in some fashion. So it's left and left, right and right. So in press, we have this motion here, and now this comes around to here, even though we're on the left foot here. But this is going to be we're putting this into place, and we're pulling this arm towards it. And then as we shift the weight forward, now this becomes static, this becomes stuck in place, and this is applying a press forward, because now my front foot is full, my front hand is static, like a statue. My left back foot is empty, well, not completely empty, but is emptier, which means we're applying pressure through that side of the body at the end of it, at the beginning and then at the end. They switch roles, which is pretty cool. Same principle is at work with brush knee. When considering the body mechanics in this way, as a division between right and left, and applying this opposite correlation between right and left, we want to remember that the static hand is kind of like you're placing it into a position as if it's its own point of reference, and then the other hand is now using that point of reference in order to bring things to or away from it. That's going to help in understanding or unlocking some of these martial applications that you might be looking for in the form. But we're not really going over the martial applications for this presentation. This is just to explain the fundamentals and internals of each of these movements. Now we've looked at hands, we've looked at feet. We should look at the torso, because this is a really good move to look at what we mean by upright posture, what we mean by straightened axis. You hopefully already have an idea of what we mean by core. So typical Taiji terminology, the way I use the core, the way I refer to the core, that's referring to dantian. But I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds of foreign terminology because I'm sure my pronunciation is terrible, and translation as core works just as well, at least for rudimentary purposes like here. You want to think of your core as sort of roughly a ball that is sitting just above but in between where your femurs sit in your hips. You want to think of your pelvis as a bowl of water, your core as a ball in the middle of that bowl of water. Your axis is going to be a line or a bar extending upwards out of that ball. Hopefully I didn't lose you on any of this, but that shouldn't be too difficult to imagine. When we're practicing Tai Chi, when we're training Tai Chi, it really helps if you sort of visualize the interior of your body, not necessarily in the way that you would like a cadaver where you see all the blood vessels and the specific sinew and tendon, but rather as almost like you would if you were drawing it in a CAD program and recreating like a skeleton in a CAD program. So instead of pulling all of these bones apart in the arm and identifying each and every single bone in them and then trying to think, how do I feel this particular bone here? At the beginning, you don't have to do that. And even as you gain mastery, your internal image of your body isn't going to look exactly like a skeleton covered in blood vessels and sinew and stuff like that. It might. I mean, maybe you just think differently than I do, but I found that would be a very complicated way that might inhibit learning. So instead, think of it a bit more simplistically. You know that your arm is a couple of rods with a hinge, with a ball joint, and a hand. The hand is its own thing. You know that I don't want to get into hand stuff. Whenever we're doing Tai Chi, always sort of treat the hand as relaxed, fingers mostly straight, and after that, wait to gain more understanding of the rest of the body before we start getting into differences between this, very subtle differences in hand posture. They are important, but not really that important at a beginner level. So you kind of know that the body can be thought of as a bunch of different rods with different kinds of hinges involved, and the more complicated the joint, the more difficult to visualize what that hinge kind of looks like, such as the spine. Now, Taiji for the most part makes this relatively simple as far as spinal posture goes because there's very, very little twist in Taiji where the hips and the shoulders are not with each other, where they're at odds with each other. In fact, off the top of my head, in the Yang long form, that really just doesn't happen. In some of the classical Yang lines, you will see that in like one or two moves, but it's very rare and very subtle and very slight. And the Chen style as well, it does happen, but it's very rare and very subtle and very slight. It's not, contrast this with something like Bagua, where that twist, that central torso twist is very pronounced in many of their movements, many of their postures. Taiji doesn't usually do that. So whenever we're positioning our torso for Taiji, we can always begin by recognizing that we should position our shoulders above our hips. And that's going to help us draw this pseudo-symmetrical understanding between shoulders and hips. The hips are where the legs connect to the torso. The shoulders are where the arms connect to the torso. And the legs mostly stay attached to the ground except for kicks. And if you're doing Chen, maybe a couple of jumps. But the arms are never touching the ground. The arms are out in the open and are touching another person in a martial position, martial context. But still, when you have this pseudo-symmetrical understanding, you start to connect left hip to left shoulder, right hip to right shoulder, in addition to recognizing relationships between left hip and right shoulder, right hip and left shoulder. You can start to see, like, well, if I open my hips, I can open the shoulders. If I close one hip, I can apply torsion through the other shoulder, or vice versa, right? you can play around with it. And as you do your moves, you can start to pay attention to, as I'm going through this particular motion slowly, what are my two hips doing? What are my two legs doing? Because the hips are the gateways to the legs, right? When we think with the hip, like when we start thinking about how much weight's in one leg, that almost invites us to consider, well, what's that hip doing? Is that hip open or closed? Is it too tense? Can I relax it? Can I relax it more? And then from there, build up to the shoulder and think, well, what's my shoulder doing at the same time? But I'm getting ahead of myself because I don't want to get too much into the hips and shoulder relationships just with brush knee. We'll have another piece just on that later on down the road. But getting back to the issue of what our torso is doing, when we are upright, when we're referring to being upright, we want to distinguish uprightness from having a perfectly straight back. Some of you probably, hopefully, at some point in your life played an instrument, and hopefully that was some sort of classical instrument, at least at some point, to get some familiarity of it. If you didn't, well, it's never too late to start, but I'm sure you probably watched a movie with some sort of overbearing piano instructor or something like that, or just remember, like, when you're playing piano or when you're playing cello or violin, you're always taught your posture, your music starts from your posture. There are some masters of their instruments for whom this doesn't seem to apply, like Glen Gould for some reason, but everybody else you taught at the beginning, pull that crown all the way up, nice and straight all the way up, and then you put your hands on the keyboard. Same with cello, same with violin, this all the way upright. For Tai Chi, you want to think of half of that, but not all of it, because for instruments, you're sitting down most of the time. For these postures, flute, clarinet, same exact thing, but you're sitting down all the time. For Tai Chi, you're never sitting down. You're sitting into your hips in a certain sense, but you're still standing on your legs the whole time. So when we're thinking of upright, if we're sitting, then our pelvis is in a particular position that is supporting our weight in a column straight up and down. But when we're standing, that pelvis, for Tai Chi purposes, is dropped. And if we drop our pelvis and then try to straighten our back the same way, we end up overemphasizing the natural S-curve that's already there. And for Tai Chi martial principle, for Tai Chi, actually it's general physical principle, we want to drop the pelvis, pull the crown of the head, and then relax everything around that stretch up through the spine. And that's going to be a slightly different posture than sort of the piano teacher upright thing. If you do the piano teacher upright thing in a standing position, you're going to feel like you're actually pulling yourself backwards a little bit, because it's basically what you're doing. And if you do that from like a bow stance, let's say we're in our bow stance here, and we do the straight up and down stuff, like perfectly straight up and down, say piano posture, well, now that actually tenses my back hip in a way where I'm pulling myself into my back hip. And now suddenly straight up and down actually becomes slightly backward intended. Slightly backward tilted, one might even say. We don't want that. Even if you're practicing Tai Chi for its health and physical benefits, its balance, its breathing, all these other things, you still want to maintain all of the things that it teaches you martially, even though you never probably expect to ever use them. Having a slightly forward fold in the hips is a classical martial principle. If we're dealing with a punch or a strike coming towards us and we're positioned backwards, this is really bad news, much less into the face. If we're slightly forwards, but we're straight through the spine, not bent, not hunched, never hunched, straight, slightly forwards, this is not good, but a lot better than back. Back, sustaining strikes to the head, certainty of brain damage, very, very high. Slightly forward, brain damage possibly. You maintain consciousness, you can take the strike better because that's going, your whole body is absorbing the strike as opposed to just the head and the neck. So long story short, when we're doing brush knee, this is why, as you can see, as I'm coming through here and then turning, as you see out on the floor, I am still straight, it might look like I'm coming forward with my head, but it's not like I'm pulling the head forward to do the move. This stays straight up and down, and then the slight tilt, the slight fold in the hips is a consequence of maintaining that straightness and turning through the hips and then pressing forward, pushing forward with the arms. One last piece for brush knee is going to be our hand position. I already said I don't want to talk about hand stuff too much because it gets a little too subtle and too lost in the weeds with it. But I do want to look at what the hands are doing at the very end of the move. So as mentioned before, we're not doing like a push straight from the shoulder, like a push-up, like when we're doing push-ups. We're not doing that kind of push here. We're also not doing the sort of Taiji push that we saw a couple moves ago at the end of grasp sparrow's tail, where we're pulling back and then dropping and then pushing forward. It's more similar to that than it is to like a push-up, but it's still not either one of those. Instead, we're kind of face this way. Instead, what we're doing is we're coming up here, and the hand is nice and big and circular and round, and then turn, and the very last bit of it, as you can see, drops. The palm, fingers lead the way and then drop into place. Elbow is still down, right? I don't want my elbow sideways. Elbow's still down. But we want to think of, if we're going to emphasize a push in this move, which we don't have to, but if we're going to emphasize a push in this move, that push is coming from that drop. And that drop is going to be the external expression of what's going on internally, all the way back down at the hips. So we don't want to think of push, right? We're just throwing our whole body forward with just that one drop. That's not what we want. We want to think of dropping through the hips, turning through the hips, and as the elbow is actually at that point already dropped, this drop motion comes like so. One. Actually, I can demonstrate on this. I don't want to get into applications because that's going to get you thinking too much about one aspect of the move at the expense of all the others. But for the sake of understanding why we are dropping our wrist, doing it on the left side this time, I will show that as we come in through here, you don't want to think of pushing out like we're doing a push-up. Likewise, we're not coming here like I mentioned before and then pushing out like a push-up. We're coming through, turn, and then dropping into place. Dropping into place. Drop. The hands, fingers lead the way. As the fingers make contact, this drops into place. That brings us to the end of brush knee, number 6, part 6. Key points, just to reiterate what to look at for brush knee. We want to make sure that we are stepping forward in a way that makes sense. We're not going too far forward onto our front leg. We want to make sure that our hands are coming low and high, but not at the expense of our shoulders contorting out of position. We want to make sure that our torso stays straight and mostly upright, and we're not wobbling. I didn't mention that, but you can probably assume that we don't want to be wobbling when we're shifting our weight or turning our waist, turning our hips. And lastly, we want to make sure that our palm is dropping into position the right way, and the hands are not pushing like we're doing push-ups or like we're shoving something away from us. Taiji doesn't really rely much on shoving so much as just on the right proper kind of application of a pushing sensation. If you've stuck around and you've watched this much so far, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope this finds you well and improves some element of your training, perhaps something you haven't thought of before, perhaps something that you have thought of before but just didn't really click. As mentioned every single time, these are not intended to be substitutes for in-person instruction. You should have a real flesh and blood instructor whom you take lessons from in person whenever possible. Someone you can see 360 degrees around and not just one angle from a YouTube video. If you're on the market for one, feel free, and you're local, stop by our studio here in bucolic Glen Burnie, Maryland, and we'll get you sorted and squared away. Otherwise, find somebody in your area that is doing this type of stuff and preferably does it well. If you're a beginner, you might not know how well they're doing it, but that's okay. If you're more advanced, then great. Hopefully I'm not saying anything that is too foreign to what you've already studied. So once more, thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you here in the next one.